The Forgotten Graveyard. The town of Whispering Pines was the kind of place people spoke about in hushed tones, a forgotten dot on the map that seemed to belong to another era entirely. Hidden in the misty hills of rural Pennsylvania, it was said to be a relic from a time long past, a town left behind as the world moved on. According to local legend, those who ventured into Whispering Pines rarely returned unchanged, if they returned at all. There were stories of empty streets where shadows moved without cause, and houses that seemed to breathe in the quiet, holding memories too dark to recount. It was November 2nd, the Day of the Dead, and George found himself staring out the kitchen window, watching as thick clouds gathered in the fading light. A few crows perched in the barren oak tree near his parents' old house, their black feathers stark against the gray sky. They seemed to stare straight at him, unblinking, as if waiting. He had heard that crows could sense danger, that they were messengers in some way. But George shook off the thought. Tonight, he'd finally prove to his friends and to himself that he wasn't the fearful one. George was an introvert by nature, a quiet guy with dark, unruly hair and a gaze that tended to drift downward whenever conversations got too loud. At 25, he was still the kind of person who overthought every decision, who second-guessed himself. But his friends Mike, Danny, Sarah, and Eddie were all he had, and he craved their approval more than he cared to admit. They were daring him to visit Whispering Pines, a place they'd heard about in snippets of urban legend, and tonight he'd finally go along. He'd be brave. Eddie, the one who'd come up with the idea, was a prankster with a mischievous grin that rarely faded. Mike was bold with a booming voice and an intimidating presence, the kind of guy who never backed down from a dare. Danny, wiry and quick with his words, loved to poke fun at anything remotely supernatural. And then there was Sarah, the only girl in the group, whose red hair and piercing gaze matched her fiery spirit. With them, George felt like he could be someone else, someone braver, bolder. Sneaking out his father's old sedan, George drove them toward Whispering Pines, his heart hammering as they left behind the familiar streets and entered winding country roads that stretched out through thick forest. Shadows flickered between the trees, and their laughter quieted, replaced by an uneasy silence as the last traces of sunlight disappeared. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for the car, twisting and turning deeper into the wooded hills. Finally, after what felt like hours, they saw it. A tattered, weather-beaten sign reading, "Welcome to Whispering Pines." The paint was faded, the letters barely legible, as if the town itself didn't want to be remembered. The air grew colder, the fog thickening as they drove on, until the headlights revealed the town's main street, a narrow, desolate strip lined with buildings that seemed to lean under their own weight. Whispering Pines looked like a town long abandoned, caught in a time warp. Dilapidated houses sat alongside crumbling storefronts, their windows shattered or darkened with grime. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, revealing warped wood underneath. The sidewalks were cracked and covered in layers of dead leaves, blown there by gusts of icy wind. A few street lamps still stood, though none of them were lit, casting long, ominous shadows in the fog. Every building seemed to have its own eerie presence. An old general store with a sign barely hanging on by a nail, a diner with its door hanging open and darkness spilling out like a silent invitation, and houses with their curtains drawn tightly shut, as if hiding from something. George felt a chill run down his spine as he saw what looked like faint handprints smudged on some of the windows, almost as if someone, or something, had been watching them for years, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter. The crows reappeared, perched along the telephone wires that sagged above the road. They watched the group silently, their dark eyes gleaming in the dim light, a sight that only added to the weight of the quiet. Mike, sitting in the passenger seat, forced a laugh that felt out of place. "Look at this place. It's like a ghost town. You'd think it was abandoned a century ago." Sarah, peering through the window, shivered. "I don't know, Mike. It feels like people just left, like they dropped everything and walked away." As George navigated the narrow streets, he caught fleeting glimpses of figures in the fog, shadows that slipped between buildings or stood in doorways only to vanish when he blinked. At one point, He thought he saw a face in the cracked window of a church, but when he looked again, it was gone. The silence pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating, and George's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by people, but by something else entirely. They finally reached the outskirts of town, where the cemetery lay hidden behind a rusted iron gate, half buried under a dense layer of ivy and dead leaves. The gate was flanked by two statues of angels, their faces weathered and eroded by time, their eyes hollowed out, giving them a sorrowful, almost accusing look. The path leading into the cemetery was lined with rows of crooked headstones, some half sunken into the earth, others leaning like they were struggling to escape. George parked the car, his stomach knotting as he looked at the cemetery. The trees loomed overhead, their branches bare and skeletal, stretching over the graves like a canopy of twisted arms. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, its call echoing through the stillness, adding to the unnerving quiet that blanketed the place. Danny chuckled nervously, breaking the silence. "Well, this is it. Ready to see some ghosts, George?" Eddie, always the instigator, nudged him with a smirk. "Come on, George, don't chicken out now. You're not scared, are you?" George glanced back at the town, where the crows still perched, watching them. He felt a pang of doubt, a voice in the back of his mind urging him to leave. But he pushed it down, steeling himself. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to let his friends see his hesitation. Mike, eager to lead the way, shoved open the iron gate with a loud creak, and they all stepped inside, their footsteps crunching against the frosted ground. The air was thick, cold, and heavy, and George couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him was somehow alive. As they walked deeper into the cemetery, shadows seemed to shift among the graves, and the wind carried faint whispers that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The town's quietness had followed them into the cemetery. "Guess they all got too scared to come back," he joked, but even he seemed uneasy, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. Sarah stayed close to George, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was usually the bold one, the first to jump into anything daring. But tonight she seemed tense, her eyes darting around the cemetery. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, shivering. It's freezing all of a sudden." George felt it too, a sharp drop in temperature, as if they'd stepped into a pocket of winter. His breath misted in front of him, and he tightened his jacket, feeling the chill sink deep into his bones. The fog had thickened, swirling around them, turning the gravestones into ghostly shapes that loomed out of the darkness. Eddie grinned, unfazed, and raised his flashlight to a particularly large, ornate headstone. "This place is amazing. It's like one of those cemeteries from an old horror movie. Just think about all the stories buried here." But as Eddie moved the flashlight around, something strange happened. The light flickered, then dimmed, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and contort across the ground. George squinted, his heart pounding as he thought he saw movement in the mist. A shadow, or maybe a figure, slipping between the graves. Did you see that?" George whispered, his voice barely audible. "See what?" Mike asked, turning to look where George was pointing. But there was nothing there, only the fog, shifting and swirling like smoke. George shook his head, trying to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He took a step back, his foot crunching over a broken twig, and froze when he heard a faint rustling behind him. He spun around, expecting to see one of his friends, but instead, he saw a crow perched on a gravestone, watching him with gleaming eyes. It let out a low caw, its voice echoing through the silence. And for a moment, George felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to leave the cemetery before it was too late. The crow tilted its head, as if in warning, and George shivered. Eddie, oblivious to the growing tension, continued to explore, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the graves. "Come on, George," he called, waving him over to a larger crypt at the end of the path. "You're not scared, are you?" George hesitated, his eyes lingering on the crow, but he forced himself to follow Eddie. He wasn't about to back out now, not when they'd come all this way. As he walked, he caught Sarah's eye, and she gave him a small, reassuring nod, though her face was tense. They gathered around the crypt, its heavy stone door slightly ajar, as though someone had recently entered or left. The others huddled close, their breath misting into cold air, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. Mike pushed the door open a bit more, peering inside, his face a mask of forced bravado. "It's just an old crypt," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "Nothing to be scared of." But as he stepped closer, a cold draft swept out from the darkness within, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell of decay. George's stomach turned, and he felt his pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. The air inside the crypt felt wrong, heavy and thick, as though it were tainted by something unseen. "Let's go inside," Eddie suggested, his grin widening. "Come on, George, you first." George swallowed hard, his hands clammy as he took a step forward. The others followed, their flashlights casting long shadows that danced along the stone walls. The interior of the crypt was small and damp, with rows of stone coffins lining the walls. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of their breathing. But then, a sound echoed through the crypt, a soft, whispering murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. George froze, his heart racing as he strained to hear the words. It was faint, almost like the wind, but there was something familiar about it, something that sent a chill down his spine. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. The others nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. The whispering grew louder, filling the crypt with a sound that was both beautiful and terrible, like a haunting melody played just out of tune. George felt his skin prickle, and he took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. "We should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This doesn't feel right." But Eddie laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, George. Don't tell me you believe in ghost stories now." He turned back to the crypt, ignoring the whispering, as though determined to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. But as George looked around, he noticed something strange. The fog had thickened, swirling around the crypt like a living thing, and the shadows on the walls seemed to pulse and move, as though they had a life of their own. He could feel the air pressing in on him, cold and suffocating, and for the first time, he felt genuinely afraid. Outside, the crows began to caw, their cries echoing through the cemetery, sharp and piercing in the stillness. The whispering grew louder, filling the crypt like an eerie melody, swirling around them in disjointed echoes. George's heart was hammering, the cold dampness of the crypt pressing in on him, making it hard to breathe. He could see his friends' faces in the dim light, their wide eyes darting around the small chamber as though looking for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, only the shadows, which seemed to pulse and grow, reaching out toward them from the corners of the room. "All right, this is getting weird," Danny muttered, backing up toward the entrance. His usual sarcasm was gone, replaced by an edge of fear. "Let's get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps." "Are you serious, Danny?" Eddie replied, his voice barely masking his own nerves. "We came all this way. Don't you want to see if there's anything more?" But even Eddie seemed uncertain, glancing over his shoulder toward the fog that had thickened outside, blotting out the view of the cemetery. George took a few steps back, feeling a wave of nausea wash over him. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on his chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. He glanced toward the entrance, where the fog was swirling, thicker now, almost solid, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew they should leave. Every instinct in him was screaming to get out, to put as much distance as possible between them and this place. "Seriously, Eddie," George said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we've seen enough. This place, it doesn't feel right." But before anyone could move, a faint scratching noise echoed from deeper within the crypt, somewhere beyond the rows of stone coffins. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, scraping and grating against the stone walls. Sarah clutched George's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They all froze, straining to listen. The scratching continued, a slow, deliberate sound, as if something, or someone, was clawing its way out of the walls. The whispering grew softer, as though retreating, replaced by the steady, rhythmic scrape that echoed through the silence, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mike took a step back, his bravado completely gone. What the hell is that?" he stammered, his face pale. Eddie swallowed, his eyes darting toward the shadows that loomed larger around them. "Probably just rats," he said, though his voice trembled. "Or, the wind or something. This place is old. Things make noises." But George knew it was no rat, no draft of wind. The scratching was too steady, too purposeful. It felt like a warning, a signal of something deeper, something ancient and angry that lingered within the crypt. He took a step toward the exit, his hand gripping Sarah's arm, urging her to follow. Just then, Danny's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the room before it died altogether, plunging them into near darkness. The only light came from George's flashlight, but even it seemed weaker now, the beam barely penetrating the heavy shadows that pressed in around them. "Oh, fantastic," Danny muttered, his voice tight. "This is great. Let's leave before anything else goes wrong." They turned toward the entrance, but the thick fog outside had rolled in, seeping into the crypt like an unnatural mist, swirling around their feet. George felt his skin prickle, every instinct screaming that they weren't alone. The crows outside had started cawing, their voices sharp and frantic, echoing through the cemetery. As they reached the door, George glanced back, a chill crawling up his spine as he saw something shift in the darkness. A figure, faint and shadowy, stood near the back of the crypt, partially hidden in the shadows. Its form was barely visible, just a faint outline in the dim light, but he could feel its gaze on him, cold and unblinking. "Go," he whispered to his friends, pushing them toward the exit. "We need to go. Now!" But as they stumbled out of the crypt, the fog had thickened even more, enveloping the cemetery like a shroud. The gravestones loomed like dark sentinels, and the crows had scattered, their harsh cries replaced by a chilling silence. They could barely see a few feet in front of them, and every step felt as though it took them deeper into a maze of shadows and fog. "Where's the car?" Sarah asked, panic edging her voice as she looked around, disoriented. "It was right here," George said, scanning the fog-covered cemetery. But the road, the iron gates, the path they had taken, all of it was gone, swallowed by the mist. They were trapped, surrounded by the graves that seemed to stretch on endlessly, as though the cemetery had grown, expanding to keep them within its borders. Eddie shined his flashlight around, the beam barely piercing the dense fog. "This doesn't make any sense. We just came from there, but there was no way out." Every direction they turned seemed to lead them deeper into the cemetery, the gravestones rising like walls, marking their way but providing no escape. George felt his heartbeat quicken, the weight of the fog pressing down on him, thick and suffocating. As they wandered, a low, distant sound echoed through the mist, a whisper, soft and unintelligible, but growing louder with every step. It seemed to come from all around them, the voices blending together into a mournful chant, a dirge that seeped into their bones, chilling them from the inside out. George's flashlight flickered, and he tightened his grip, glancing over his shoulder. He thought he saw a figure moving through the fog, a dark silhouette drifting between the graves, watching them with hollow eyes. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "We're not alone here." The whispering grew louder, filling the air, a symphony of voices that seemed to come from the graves themselves. George's hands were shaking, his mind racing as he realized the truth. They were lost, trapped in a place where the dead lingered, a cemetery that had no end. As they wandered deeper into the cemetery, George's sense of dread grew, sinking into his bones like the cold fog that blanketed everything around them. The whispering voices were louder now, a chorus of mournful cries that echoed off the stones and faded into the mist. Every direction looked the same, rows upon rows of graves stretching endlessly, twisting and shifting in the fog, as though the cemetery were alive, reshaping itself to keep them from escaping. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, clutching George's arm. "Where's the car? We didn't walk this far in." "It was right there." George didn't have an answer. All he knew was the creeping realization that they were no longer in the same cemetery they'd entered. The twisted trees and gravestones seemed different, more ancient, the inscriptions on the stones so worn and faded that they were unreadable, as if they'd been there for centuries. Eddie's flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the fog. "Maybe it's some kind of trick," he muttered, though his voice held none of its usual confidence. "Maybe the fog is messing with our sense of direction." But George knew it was more than that. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching them from just beyond the mist. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, slipping between the gravestones, and every time he turned, he was met with nothing but empty fog. "I don't like this," Danny said, his voice trembling. "This is wrong. We need to get out of here." Mike, usually the bravest among them, looked shaken, his face pale as he scanned the endless rows of graves. "We should never have come here. This place, it's not right." They continued moving, sticking close together, their footsteps crunching over the frost-covered ground. But no matter how far they walked, the cemetery stretched on, an endless maze of gravestones and statues, all worn and forgotten, like remnants of a time long past. And then George noticed something that made his blood run cold. The gravestones, they were all blank. He'd assumed they were simply old, the inscriptions faded with time. But now he could see that they weren't just faded. They were completely smooth, untouched by any chisel or inscription. It was as if they'd been placed there empty, waiting. "Why are there no names?" George asked, his voice shaking. "These graves, they're all blank." The others looked around, realization dawning on their faces. The blank stones stared back at them, rows of unmarked graves stretching endlessly, each one like an empty slot, waiting to be filled. Then, in the distance, a figure appeared, emerging from the fog. It was faint at first, barely more than a shadow, but as it came closer, George could make out the shape of a woman, her figure draped in tattered, flowing fabric. Her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the dim light, and her face held an expression of sorrow or perhaps warning. The woman lifted her hand, pointing to the ground at their feet, her gaze never leaving George's. He felt a chill wash over him, a bone-deep terror that made him want to run but kept him rooted to the spot. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a gravestone directly beside him. George glanced down and felt his heart stop. There, engraved on the blank stone, was his own name, clear as day, as though it had been carved into the stone while he stood there. He stumbled back, horror flooding through him as he looked at the other gravestones. One by one, he saw them: Sarah, Mike, Eddie, Danny, all their names freshly carved on the stones around them. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They were no longer visitors. They had become part of the cemetery, trapped, claimed by whatever curse lingered in this forgotten place. "No," Sarah gasped, stepping away from her own gravestone. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The whispering grew louder, the voices seeming to come from the graves themselves, a chorus of lost souls, each one caught in the same trap that now held them. George felt a sickening dread settle over him as he understood the truth. The cemetery wasn't just a place. It was the entire town. Whispering Pines was a graveyard in disguise, its inhabitants nothing more than spirits bound to this land, unable to leave. "We were never meant to leave," George said, his voice hollow as the full horror of their fate settled over him. "This place, it's a trap. They draw people here, keep them, make them part of it." The fog thickened, swallowing the town around them. The buildings, the streets, even the trees began to fade, dissolving into the mist until there was nothing left but endless rows of gravestones. Whispering Pines had vanished, leaving only the cemetery, stretching endlessly in every direction, a place without borders or escape. George felt a crushing despair as he looked at his friends, their faces pale with terror. The woman in the tattered dress lingered in the fog, her expression unreadable, before she faded into the mist, leaving them alone in the silence. "George," Eddie whispered, his voice trembling. "What do we do now?" But George had no answer. There was nothing left to do, nowhere left to go. They were trapped, just like the souls before them, destined to wander the endless rows of gravestones, their names carved into the stones that had waited patiently for their arrival. And as the fog closed in, sealing them into the forgotten cemetery, George heard the whispers rise once more, a chilling symphony that would echo through eternity, a reminder of all the souls who had come and would never leave. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more stories like this, leave a like and share with your friends.